The tyrannical rule of Manchester City in the Premier League is finally coming to an end. Or at least that's what you might be thinking if you're an Arsenal fan who's chasing their first Premier League title in 20 years.
Damn!
So in case you missed it, we just saw the two best teams in the Premier League going at it, with Manchester City, the current champions, hosting Arsenal, last year's second place, at the Etihad. And due to the nature of how both managers like to play, and realistically with Arteta being just a mini version of Pep Guardiola, and how they both like to line up their teams, a lot of people expected this to be an absolute snooze fest, and it also doesn't help that over the years, this game is usually as boring as doing your taxes. Well, to the footballing world surprise, we actually got a pretty entertaining game. The match would end 2-2 with Haaland scoring an early goal, Arsenal getting 2 goals back and also a red card before halftime, and in the second half would see an incredible defensive feat from Arsenal that would ultimately be for almost nothing as Stones found City's equalizer at the 97th minute. So at the end of the day, especially when comparing it to the previous games, this was an absolute belter. Much debate has come from this game on who this result was more beneficial for given the context of the game. But for me, the biggest thing that comes out of this match that could greatly affect how the rest of the league season plays out is the fact that Rodri would be forced to come out at the 21st minute due to injury, with news coming out after the match that Rodri's season would essentially be over as he would put damage on his ACL. Rodri's arguably the best center defensive midfielder in the world at this very moment, and he brings such a value to this Man City side. For as much praise as Foden, Haaland, Kevin De Bruyne, and all of City's attackers get, Rodri really finds himself being the heartbeat of this team, and we even saw this for the Spanish national team where he would help lead them to a Euro victory while also winning the Player of the Tournament award. But with that being said, Man City is going to be without this guy for the rest of the season, and this is going to be a huge loss for them considering that Arsenal is going to be breathing down their necks the entire season. It's really rare when Rodri would miss games for Man City, but if we take a look at the games that he did miss, either through card suspensions or injuries, it's safe to say that the league might be a lot more difficult for Man City this year. One could say Man City might be cooked. And real quick boys, before we get into Rodri, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe on the video. Weekly football videos, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss an upload. If you're not new to the channel boys, welcome back. Glad to have you around for another video. But with that being said, let's take a microscope and take a look into City without Rodri. So during his time with Man City, there's only been a handful of spells where he has missed a couple of games. And usually he doesn't really miss that many games, which is a big difference to now where he's out for the rest of the season. So in the 1920 season, he missed 4 games due to a muscle injury. In the 23-24 season, he would miss a total of 4 games due to either red card or yellow card accumulation. At the beginning of this season, he would miss 3 games due to a hamstring injury. Altogether, he's been out of action for 11 games. In those 11 matches, City have won 5, lost 4, and drew 1. So essentially, we're 50-50 without this guy. You see what I mean now when I say how important he is to this team? The most notable aspect of these numbers really comes when you take a look at who they did and did not beat. For example, their 5 wins came against the 15th place Aston Villa, an 18th place Southampton, an EFL Cup victory against the same Southampton side, Chelsea in the first game of this current campaign, and a newly promoted Ipswich Town. I won't count the Community Shield as a win. I'm going to count it as a draw because technically by the end of the match it was all squared. They won the game in penalties, but I think for the record book that more so counts as a draw. But overall, right, you can see they were clearly making light work of the easy matches that were coming up to them. Essentially all the wins that they did get without Rodri. These were all games that they were supposed to win and they did. These are the type of games realistically where the depth that City has is usually applauded and they finally get their time to shine. But if you put a microscope on the games that they did lose during this period without Rodri, you see how his absence is a problem for this side. So in the 23-24 season, Rodri would pick up a red card against Nottingham Forest, which would see him miss 3 games of action. And the first game that he would miss would be an EFL Cup tie against Newcastle. So overall, the squad was pretty heavily rotated because of the fact that it was an EFL Cup tie, which historically Pep Guardiola doesn't take the most serious, especially at the early stages. So he would put out Rico Lewis and Calvin Phillips in the midfield to make do with Rodri's absence. The City in the first half did look very much like they were in control. Newcastle definitely looked nervous and City honestly had the best of the chances and also most of the possession. However, shortly after halftime, Newcastle pretty much just played straight through City's midfield and essentially found their go-ahead goal. From this point, Newcastle would take the game to City and the midfield was honestly getting completely overrun, which made it very easy for Newcastle to just take the game to City. This was just an abysmal performance from the midfield. Granted, the first half half wasn't too bad, but that second half was just poor. It felt like City was scrambling, and Newcastle honestly was just cooking. Especially once Bruno Guimaraes came into the game, City's midfield stood no chance. It's hard to play without your best player, of course, but when you go from Rodri to Calvin Phillips, you kind of have to accept whatever's coming to you. So after this disappointing cup loss, they would then have to play against Wolves, who was currently sitting at the bottom half of the table. And in a shock result, Wolves would actually win the match 2-1. So for this game, to replace Rodri, you have Nunez and Kovacic playing essentially in a double pivot in the midfield. And going from Rodri to Matheus Nunes, a guy who Guardiola really, you can tell, isn't the biggest fan of, is an insane drop off. So you could see the cracks of this team early on without Rodri in that midfield, as they would give the ball away cheaply pretty early on into the game, and from there Pedro Neto just didn't really look back. He would go on this crazy solo run all the way from the midfield, ultimately ended up in Wolves finding their opening goal. In typical City fashion, they would keep a lot of the possession after this moment, but they were never really able to do anything with it. After halftime, City would find an equalizer through a very beautiful free kick goal from Julian Alvarez. So you would think City got their equalizer, they're up against Wolves, they'll come back, but you are wrong. After this, the second goal came from, as Pep Guardiola called him, the Korean guy. After some great work down the right hand side from Wolves, the ball essentially found itself in the box in the hands of Hwang Hee-chan. And with the defensive midfielders nowhere to be found, he would comfortably put the ball into the back of the net, and 14th place Wolves would get their winning goal. So in this match, you could really see the cracks in this side without Rodri. They had control of the match, but they were up against a very inferior opponent, but they were never really able to create much. And when it did get down to the nitty gritty, the lack of Rodri's presence in that kind of top of the box area where center defensive midfielders usually shine, especially the best ones, really gave way for these Wolves players to just kind of attack City. So after Wolves did get their second goal, City of course had their possession, but they were never really able to do much with it. And again, kind of echoing my point from earlier. So they did look very unconvincing, and they would drop points in this match. And then the very next week, they then had to play against Premier League favorites Arsenal at the Emirates. So this time, Pep went with Rico Lewis and Kovacic in the middle, and you could say honestly, Lewis offers a little bit more defensive stability than Matheus Nunes, and overall, he might even just be a better player outright. So now playing an even better opponent, City never really had a full grasp on the game. The match was incredibly back and forth, and the lack of Rodri's presence made it very easy for Arsenal to create a ton of chances. Arsenal would find a late winner through Martinelli, and this was all just compounded from a very poor presence in the midfield. So poor, in fact, that both midfielders, Rico Lewis and Matheus Nunes, both had under a 7 rating, and they would both get hooked off the match at just about the 70th minute. The warning signs were definitely there, but at the end of the day, it was a red card suspension, so City did know that they were going to have Rodri back pretty soon. Unfortunately for City though, missing a player the caliber of Rodri in a match this big that could realistically decide the title, which it did not, of course, because Arsenal would go on to bottle the league, was a huge miss. But ultimately, they would have to just keep it pushing. So Rodri would get reintegrated into the side after the Arsenal match, but a couple months later, he would pick up an accumulation of yellow cards, seeing him miss another game, this time against Aston Villa. This is a Villa side that's led by Emery, who were in red hot form, so this was not going to be the same Aston Villa side that they beat a couple of years ago, but without Rodri. So for this match, Pep Guardiola cooked up Rico Lewis and John Stones playing in the midfield, and there was just so many gaps. They looked like headless chickens out there. It was just pathetic. Emery's system is very front-footed, so meaning they were going to push City back as much as they could. With the likes of Ollie Watkins, Leon Bailey, and then John McGinn on the flank pushing forward as much as he can, City were bound to get found out. And honestly, the majority of the match, Bailey was kind of just tucking in between the center defensive midfielders and the center backs, and he was having a hell of a day out there. He would pick up the ball and just create problems. He was terrorizing these poor center defensive midfielders. And lo and behold, that is how Aston Villa would find the goal to win this match. From Bailly picking up the ball in between the spaces and just creating something. So City never really had a grasp on the match, and it's hard to control when the guy who wins everything and keeps the ball moving is not in the picture. So you can see here from these last 4 games that I just talked about, 3 of which were against top level opposition, and 1 of which was against a pretty bad side who honestly just decided to take the game to City. The biggest theme here is how much the midfield is unable to control games without Rodri. He was very missed in these matches, and like I said, when they're playing against poor opposition, Wolves aside, they're usually able to just cook something up and it works. But when you're playing against teams who have much better midfield systems, good pressing systems, or a very clear style of play that usually Rodri can sniff out and make pretty ineffective, then that's different. But without him, it's a big difference. So there's 2 caveats here that could still see City winning the league, even in Rodri's absence. First of all, Pep Guardiola is one of the best managers that we've ever seen. He's a tactical genius. He tends to find solutions solutions and just make things work. He still has Rico Lewis, he still has John Stones, he still has Gundogan, he still has Kovacic, he still has even Mateus Nunes. All these guys are players who he can use, manipulate the system that he's working, and try and find the solution. And realistically, this is probably going to be what's going to work for him for the majority of the season, especially when he's coming up against, like I said, those poor teams. But when he starts having to go to Arsenal away, Chelsea away, Liverpool away, even United away, these are going to be the games where he needs players like Rodri to avoid getting his midfield overran. So that's where kind of the second solution comes in. It's Man City we're talking about here. Yes, they're in court for 115 charges of potentially breaching financial fair play, but these guys are pretty much owned by an entire country. So if they want to, in January, what's stopping them from going out there and signing some world-class center defensive midfield talent, or even someone who's currently established? You tell me. They could easily just go and sign somebody, and then GG's, it's over. Somebody who's just gonna fill in a gap for a couple of months, and then they'll probably sell them in like a year or so. City could still definitely win the league. It is gonna be a lot harder for them, and I don't see them winning the Champions League anymore without Rodri, but we're just talking about the Premier League. I think they're still gonna do it. I think it's gonna be tough for Arsenal to still kind of overpass them as a whole, but a season without Rodri could see Man City finally be cooked and Arsenal finally win their first Premier League trophy in 20 years. But who am I kidding? Arsenal just love to bottle, don't they?